Hi, Ken. My board has proposed a budget in which they're changing the way we're funding reserves. Can they do that?
The board has to budget for reserves, as I indicated in my prior video. However, there are two ways to budget for reserves and two ways to hold reserves. One way to budget for reserves is the straight line or component method, where you have a separate reserve calculation for the roof, the paving, the painting, and all other reserve assets. And the calculation is simple. You divide the number of years left in the useful life of the asset into the estimated deferred maintenance or replacement cost, and that's the amount you have to fund each year. And the money that is set aside for that particular reserve component can only be used for that reserve component. For nearly 20 years now, condominiums have been permitted to follow an alternate approach to budgeting for reserves and funding them, and that is what's called the cash flow funding method. Under the cash flow funding method, you have a projection for roughly 30 years as to your anticipated reserve expenses. And then you simply fund enough reserves every year to have enough on hand at any time during that 30-year period to cover anticipated reserve expenses. Now, obviously, this requires some foresight. Usually it requires that you do a reserve study with someone with the expertise to develop these projections. But the main difference then is that the reserve monies that are held based upon the cash flow method go into what's called a pooled account, which means they can be used for any reserve expense. So instead of having a reserve where you have a certain amount of the money held for the roof, a certain amount held for the painting, a certain amount held for the paving, and a certain amount held for each of the other reserve components, in a pooled account, you can use all or any portion of that money for any reserve expense. So to answer your question, can the board change the way we fund and hold reserves? The answer is yes, they can. It's a board decision to develop and adopt the budget. However, if you have funded reserves based upon the straight line or component method, it will require a membership vote to move those funds into a pooled account.